Hello and welcome back to Russ's Movie Corner. My name is Russ, and as you can see, I am sitting in front of my movie corner. I have my God the Father t-shirt on and my Dune movie right next to me here, and that means today we're actually continuing our series as a look into a comic book record, or CBR, I believe it's comic book record, article entitled Dune Part 2 has a chance to fix a controversial part of the Frank Herbert novel. Now, I know in the first part, I talked for like almost 40 minutes about Dune and about some of the stuff, my history with it. I talked about the movies behind me. There's a reason for that, okay? I wanted you to know just how much of a Dune fan I am and how excited I am for this, okay? Before we jump back into the article, I wanted to show, if you watched the preview for the official trailer part 2 at about 2 minutes, 2 minutes and 5 seconds to about 2 minutes and 13 seconds, there's a point where Chani is like killing Sardaukar, okay? If you look in the background, you'll see something. So, this is the illustrated Dune. And John Schkoner is the guy that created the illustrations in here. And he has some phenomenal illustrations. And I mean, some really good ones. Some of them are like ink drawings like that. And some of them are actual full color drawings like, here's some Sardaukar. And, like, here's the flight through the shield wall with the ornithopters and all that kind of stuff. Really, really excellent illustrations. I love these. They are so good. Like, here's a picture of Gurney with his inkbind scar and, like, carrying the weapons when he first walks in on Paul. Like, I think there's even... there's one of the Baron. Let me see, yeah. Like, here's Dawn at the Palace of Arakeen, and this one is one of my personal favorites. Baron Harkonnen. But let me read this first. Then I will show you. This is on page 449, and again, this is going to be a little different if you're reading a different version. It says, and that day dawned when Arrakis lay at the hub of the universe with the wheel poised to spin, from Arrakis awakening by the Princess Irulan. Will you look at that thing? Stilgar whispered. Paul lay beside him in a slit of a rock high on the shield wall rim, eye fixed to the collector of a Fremen telescope. The oil lens was focused on a starship lighter exposed by dawn in the basin below them. The tall eastern face of the ship glistened in flat light of the sun, but the shallow side still showed yellow portholes from glow globes of the night. Beyond the ship, the city of Arakeen lay cold and gleaming in the light of the northern sun. It wasn't the lighter that had excited Stilgar's awe, Paul knew, but the construction for which the lighter was only the center post. A single metal hutment, many stories tall, reached out in a 1,000-meter circle from the base of the lighter. A tent composed of interlocking metal leaves, the temporary lodging place for 5 legions of Sardaukar, and His Imperial Majesty, the Padisha Emperor, Shaddam IV. That's what John Schkoner drew. Now, again, the link will be in the description. Go back and take a look. In the background behind Chani. Ooh. Damn. I mean, it's like, it's the same thing that you got when watching Return of the King. Right? Gandalf comes riding up over the hill, and there's Minas Tirith. Right? You read the description in the book. You see some of the stuff that Alan Lee and John Howe have actually done. And there it is. In all its glory. And you're going, How the hell did they just like rip that out of my head and put it on the screen? How the hell did they rip it? I mean, holy crap. And the funny thing was, I was actually talking to a friend of mine. And I said, buddy, if they don't do that, I'm going to be extremely mad. Because that is going to absolutely piss me off. And then I saw the preview, and I called my friend on the phone. I'm like, dude, go watch the preview. Because they totally took the stuff from the book and put it in the movie. It's so fucking awesome. Oh, November can't get here fast enough. It can't come fast enough. All right. So, when last we left off, not only was I explaining how much of a Dune fan I am, but I had started the article, and we talked about how he was talking about how Muad'Dib's jihad came in, and I read from Dune Messiah, and I said that when we came back, that I would read the last chapter of Dune to show that it doesn't actually talk about the actual jihad. Okay? Dune ends with Paul securing the Imperium. Then the jihad starts, goes for 12 years, and at the beginning of Dune Messiah, it's done. Okay? In fact, at the beginning of Dune Messiah, most of the planets have been pacified. Okay? Billions have been killed. And, like, people know that, like, Paul is kind of on the downswing of his empire. Because in 12 years, he hasn't had an heir. And so people are thinking, well, this is probably a time to, to strike. And that's what Bronso of Ix was talking about in that. Is his analysis of history, just basically humanizing Paul Muad'Dib. Paul wanted that. In reality. I mean, if he could have, he probably would have told, if he had known that Bronso of Ix was in that death cell, he probably would have said, let him go. I mean, the priest would have been like, what the fuck are you talking about? And he's like, no, let him go, man. Like there's no reason to hold him because everything he said was true. We need to demystify me. But the Fremen didn't want that. They wanted their own kind of messiah, and so they would kill anybody that got in their way. That's part of the jihad. Okay. So, this is basically the fight between Paul and Fade. Okay. In fact, you saw in the first, if you go watch official trailer number 1, okay, you'll see probably one of my favorite parts of that, where Paul actually says to him, here, I'll start. This is page 483, and again, it's going to be a little different than yours. Actually, I'm starting at the bottom of 482. It says, a sense of failure pervaded him, and he saw through it. Fade Routh the Harkonnen had slipped out of the torn uniform, stripped down to a fighting girl with a male core. This is the climax, Paul thought. From here, the future will open, the crowds part onto a kind of glory. And if I die here, they'll say I sacrificed myself, that my spirit might lead them. And if I live, they'll say Nothing can oppose Muad'Dib. Is the Atreides ready? Feyd-Rautha called, using the words of the ancient Canly ritual. Paul chose to answer him in the Fremen way. May thy knife chip and shatter. He pointed to the Emperor's blade on the floor, indicating that Feyd-Rautha should advance and take it. Now, what's really cool is that they have that really cool thing where they salute like this, right? They hold, the Atreides, and Duncan does it too. They salute like this, and then they put the blade up like this. And so, I think it was in the first preview, Paul literally goes, "May thy knife chip and shatter." And I'm just like, oh, that is going to be so epic. Yes! Another reason why I'm so excited for the sequel. Keeping his attention on Paul, Feyd-Rautha picked up the knife, balancing a moment in his hand to get the feel of it. Excitement kindled in him. This was a fight he had dreamed about, man against man, skill against skill, with no shields intervening. He could see a way to power opening before him, because the Emperor surely would reward whoever killed this troublesome duke. The reward might even be the haughty daughter and a share of the throne. And this yokel duke, this backworld adventurer, could not possibly be a match for Harkonnen trained in every device and every treachery by 1,000 arena combats. And the yokel had no way of knowing he faced more weapons than a knife here. Let us see if you are proof against poison, Feyd-Rautha thought. He saluted Paul with the Emperor's blade and said, "Meet your death, fool." "Shall we fight, cousin?" Paul asked, and he cat-footed forward, eyes on the waiting blade. His body crouched low with his own milk-white crysknife pointing out as though an extension of his arm. They circled each other, bare feet grating on the floor, watching with eyes intent for the slightest opening. "How beautifully you dance," Feyd-Rautha said. He's a talker, Paul thought. There's another weakness. He grows uneasy in the face of silence. "Have you been shriven?" Feyd-Rautha asked. Still, Paul circled in silence. And the old Reverend Mother, watching the fight from the press of the Emperor's suite, felt herself trembling. The Atreides youth had called the Harkonnen cousin. It could only mean that he knew the ancestry they shared, easy to understand because he was the Kwisatz Haderach, but the words forced her to focus on the only thing that mattered to her here. This could be a major catastrophe for the Bene Gesserit breeding program. She had seen something of what Paul had seen here, that Feyd-Rautha might kill but not be victorious. Another thought, though, almost overwhelmed her. Two end products of this long, costly program faced each other in a fight to the death that might easily claim both of them. If they both died here, that would leave only Feyd-Rautha's bastard daughter, still a baby, an unknown and unmeasured factor, and Alia, the abomination. "Perhaps you only have pagan rites here," Feyd said. "Would you like the Emperor's truth-sayer to prepare your spirit for its journey?" Paul smiled, circling to the right, alert, his black thoughts suppressed by the needs of the moment. Feyd-Rautha leaped, feinting with right hand, but with the knife shifted in a blur to his left. Paul dodged easily, noting the shield-conditioned hesitation in Feyd-Rautha's thrust. Still, it was not as great a shield conditioning as some Paul had seen, and he sensed that Feyd-Rautha had fought before against unshielded foes. "Does an Atreides run or stand and fight?" Feyd-Rautha asked. Paul resumed his silent circling. Idaho's words came back to him, the words of training from the long-ago practice floor of Caladan. "Use the first moments in study. You may miss an opportunity for a quick victory this way, but the moments of study are insurance of success. Take your time, and be sure." "Perhaps you think this dance prolongs your life a few moments," Feyd-Rautha said. "Well and good." He stopped circling, straightened. Paul had seen enough for a first approximation. Feyd-Rautha led to the left side, presenting the right hip as though the mailed fighting girl could protect his entire side. It was an action a man trained to shield or with a knife in both hands. Or, Paul hesitated, the girdle was more than what it seemed. The Harkonnen appeared too confident against a man who this day had led forces of victory against Sardaukar legions. Feyd-Rautha noted his hesitation and said, "Why prolong the inevitable? You but keep me from exercising my rights over this ball of dirt." "It's a flip dart," Paul thought. "It's a cunning one. The girdle shows no signs of tampering." "Why don't you speak?" Feyd-Rautha demanded. Paul resumed his probing circle, allowing himself a cold smile at the tone of unease in Feyd-Rautha's voice, evidence that the pressure of silence was building. "You smile, eh?" Feyd-Rautha asked, and he leapt mid-sentence. Expecting a slight hesitation, Paul almost failed to evade the down flash of blade, felt its tip scratch his arm. He silenced a sudden pain there, his mind flooded with realization that his earlier hesitation had been a trick, an overfeint. Here was more of an opponent than he had expected. There would be tricks within tricks within tricks. Your own Thafir Hawat taught me some of my skills, Phaedra said. He gave me first blood. Too bad the old fool didn't live to see it. And Paul recalled that Idaho had once said, expect only what happens in the fight. That way you'll never be surprised. Again, the two circled each other, crouched and cautious. Paul saw the return of elation in his opponent, wondered at it. Did a scratch signify that much to the man, unless there were poison on the blade? But how could that be? His own men had handled the weapon, snooped it before passing it. They were too well trained to miss an obvious thing like that. The woman you were talking to over there, Phaedra said. The little one. Is she something special to you? A pet, perhaps? Will she deserve my special attentions? Paul remained silent, probing with his inner senses, examining the blood from the wound, finding a trace of soporific from the Emperor's blade. He realigned his own metabolism to match this threat, changed molecules of the soporific, but he felt a thrill of doubt. They'd been prepared with soporific on a blade. A soporific. Nothing to alert a poison snooper, but strong enough to slow the muscles it touched. His enemies had their own plans within plans, their own stacked treacheries. Again, Phaedra leapt, stabbing. Paul, the smile frozen on his face, fainted with slowness as inhibited by the drug, and at the last instant dodged to meet the down-flashing arm of the crysknife's point. Phaedra ducked sideways and was out and away. His blade shifted to his left hand, and the measure of him was that only a slight paleness of jaw betrayed the acid pain where Paul had cut him. Let him know his own moment of doubt, Paul thought. Let him suspect poison. Treachery! Phaedra shouted. He's poisoned me! I do feel poison in my arm! Paul dropped his cloak of silence and said, only a little acid to counter the soporific on the Emperor's blade. Phaedra matched Paul's cold smile, lifted blade in left hand for a mock salute. His eyes glared rage behind the knife. Paul shifted the crysknife to his left hand, matching his opponent again, and they circled, probing. Phaedra began closing the space between them, edging in, the knife held high, anger showing in its squint of an eye instead of jaw. He feinted right and under, and they were pressed against each other, knife hands gripping, straining. Paul, cautious of Phaedra's right hip, where the suspected poison flip dart, forced the turn to the right. He almost failed to see the needle point flick out beneath the belt line. A shift, and giving in Phaedra's motion warned him. The tiny point missed Paul's flesh by the barest fraction. On the left hip. Treachery within treachery within treachery, Paul reminded himself. Using the Bene Gesserit-trained muscles, he sagged to catch a reflex in Phaedra, but the necessity of avoiding the tiny point jutting from his opponent's hip threw Paul off just enough that he missed his footing and found himself thrown hard to the floor, Phaedra on top. You see it there on my hip? Phaedra whispered. You're death, fool. Then he began twisting himself around, forcing the poison needle closer and closer. It'll stop your muscles, and my knife will finish you. There'll never be a trace left to detect. Paul strained, hearing the silent screams in his mind, his cell-stamped ancestors demanding that he use the secret word to slow Phaedra to save himself. I will not say it, Paul gasped. Phaedra gaped at him, caught in the merest fraction of hesitation. It was enough for Paul to find the weakness of balance in one of his opponent's leg muscles, and their positions were reversed. Phaedra lay partly underneath, with the right hip high, unable to turn because the tiny needle point caught against the floor beneath him. Paul twisted his left hand free, aided by the lubrication of blood from his arm, thrust once hard up underneath Phaedra's jaw. The point slid home into the brain. Phaedra jerked and sagged back, still held partly on his side by the needle embedded in the floor. Breathing deeply to restore his calm, Paul pushed himself away and got to his feet. He stood over the body, knife in hand, raised his eyes with deliberate slowness to look across the room at the Emperor. Majesty, Paul said, your force is reduced by one more. Shall we now shed sham and pretense? Shall we now discuss what must be? Your daughter wed to me, and the way open for an Atreides to sit on the throne. The Emperor turned, looked at Count Fenring. The Count met his stare, gray eyes against green. The thought lay there clearly between them, their association so long that understanding could be achieved with a glance. Kill this upstart for me, the Emperor was saying. The Atreides is young and resourceful, yes, but he's also tired from the long effort, and he'd be no match for you anyway. Call him out now. You know the way of it. Kill him. Slowly, Fenry moved his head, prolonged turning until he faced Paul. Do it, the Emperor hissed. The Count focused on Paul, seeing with eyes as Lady Margot had trained in the Bene Gesserit way, aware of the mystery and hidden grandeur about this Atreides youth. I could kill him, Finring thought, and he knew this for a truth. Something in his own secretive depths stayed the Count then, and he glimpsed briefly, inadequately, the advantage he held over Paul. A way of hiding from the youth, a furtiveness of person and motives that no eye could penetrate. Paul, aware of some of this from the way that the time nexus boiled, understood at last why he had never seen Fenring along the webs of prescience. Fenring was one of the might-have-beens, and almost Kwisatz Haderach, crippled by a flaw in the genetic pattern. A eunuch, his talent concentrated into furtiveness and inner seclusion. A deep compassion for the Count flowed through Paul, the first sense of brotherhood he'd ever experienced. Fenring, reading Paul's emotion, said, "Majesty, I must refuse." Rage overcame Shaddam IV. He took 2 short steps through the entourage, cuffed Fenring viciously across the jaw. A dark flush spread up and over the Count's face. He looked directly at the Emperor, spoke with deliberate lack of emphasis. "We have been friends, Majesty. What I do now is out of friendship. I shall forgive that you struck me." Paul cleared his throat and said, "We're speaking of the throne, Majesty." The Emperor whirled and glared at Paul. "I sit on the throne," he barked. "You'll have a throne on Seleucus Secundus," Paul said. "I put down my arms and came here on your word of bond," the Emperor shouted. "You dare threaten?" "Your person is safe in my presence," Paul said, "and Atreides promised it. Muad'Dib, however, sentences you to your prison planet. But have no fear, Majesty. I will ease the harshness of the place with all powers at my disposal. It shall become a garden world, full of gentle things." As the hidden import of Paul's words grew in the Emperor's mind, he glanced across the room at Paul. "Now we see true motives," he sneered. "Indeed." "And what of Arrakis?" the Emperor asked. "And the garden world full of gentle things?" "The Fremen have the word of Muad'Dib," Paul said. "There will be flowing water here and open to the sky, and green oases, rich with good things. But we have the spice to think of, too. Thus, there will always be a desert on Arrakis, and fierce winds, and trials to toughen a man. We Fremen have a saying, God created Arrakis to train the faithful. One cannot go against the word of God." The old truth-sayer, the Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayim, had her own view of the hidden meaning on Paul's words now. She glimpsed the jihad and said, "You cannot loose these people upon the universe." "You will think back to the gentle ways of the Sardaukar," Paul snapped. "You cannot," she whispered. "You're a truth-sayer," Paul said. "Review your words." He glanced at the Princess Royal and back to the Emperor. "Best be done quickly, Majesty." The Emperor turned a stricken look upon his daughter. She touched his arm and spoke soothingly. "For this I was trained, Father." He took a deep breath. "You cannot stay this thing," the old truth-sayer muttered. The Emperor straightened, standing stiffly with a look remembered dignity. "Who will negotiate for you, kinsman?" he asked. Paul turned, saw his mother, her eyes heavy-lidded, standing with Chani and a squad of Fedaykin guards. He crossed to them, stood looking down at Chani. "I know the reasons," Chani whispered. "If it must be, Usul." Paul, hearing the secret tears in her voice, touched her cheek. "My Sahaya need fear nothing ever," he whispered. He dropped his arm and faced his mother. "You will negotiate for me, Mother, with Chani by your side. She has wisdom and sharp eyes, and it is wisely said that no one bargains tougher than a Fremen. She will be looking through the eyes of her love for me, and with the thought of her sons to be, what they will need. Listen to her." Jessica sensed the harsh calculation in her son, put down a shudder. "What are your instructions?" she asked. "The Emperor's entire Chum Company holdings is dowry," he said. "Entire?" She was shocked, almost speechless. "He has to be stripped. I want an earldom and Chobin directorship for Gurney Halleck, and him in the fief on Caladan. There will be titles and attendant power for every surviving Atreides man, not excepting the lowliest trooper." "What of the Fremen?" Jessica asked. "The Fremen are mine. What they receive shall be dispensed by Muad'Dib. It begins with Stilgar as governor on Arrakis, but that can wait." "And for me?" Jessica asked. "Is there something you wish?" "Perhaps Caladan," she said, looking at Gurney. "I am not certain. I've become much too Fremen. And the Reverend Mother, I need time of peace and stillness in which to think." "That you shall have," Paul said, "and anything else Gurney and I can give you." Jessica nodded, feeling suddenly old and tired. She looked at Chani. "And for the royal concubine?" "No title for me," Chani whispered. "Nothing, I beg of you." Paul stared down into her eyes, remembering her suddenly as she stood once with little Leto in her arms, their child now dead in this violence. I swear to you now, he whispered, that you will need no title. That woman over there will be my wife, and you but a concubine, because this is a political thing, and we must weld peace out of this moment, enlist the great houses of the Landsraad. We must obey the forms. Yet that princess shall have no more of me than my name, no child of mine, nor touch of softness, of glance, nor instant of desire. So you say now, Chani said. She glanced across the room at the tall princess. Do you know so little of my son? Jessica whispered. See that princess standing there, so haughty and confident? They say she has pretensions of a literary nature. Let us hope she finds solace in such things. She'll have little else. A bitter laugh escaped Jessica. Think on it, Chani. That princess will have the name, yet she'll live as less than a concubine, never to know a moment of tenderness from the man to whom she is bound, while we, Chani, we who carry the name of concubine, history will call us wives. So, that's the end of the book. Literally. That's the end. Okay? So, now we come back to the article. After securing the planet Arrakis, the Fremen decided to expand their war to other places. Very true. Every planet, totaling millions, fell victim to this war. Well, I don't know. See, here's the thing. I haven't read Paul of Dune, and I don't know the exact totals. I know that they say that, like, billions died in the war, but that's mostly because the Fremen went out and they basically were like, believe in Muad'Dib or die. And people were like, why? And they took that as a, you're a heretic, blam. I think a lot of it comes from the Children of Dune miniseries, because the opening narration has Irulan basically saying that billions are dead and all this kind of stuff. So, I think Dune Messiah talks about that a little bit. But anyway, I haven't read, like, as much as I've read the original Dune, the rest of the Chronicles, I haven't read all that much, okay? In fact, like, Dune Messiah is probably one of my least favorite books. Just because it's, number one, it's short, and number two, it's just kind of, compared to the original, it's just kind of meh. You know what I mean? But anyway. So it says, every planet, totaling millions, fell victim to this war, with the rampant forces of the Atreides Empire pillaging every world aside from the traditional homeworld of Paul and his family on Caladan. Lady Jessica, Paul's mother, refused any access to the planet, even for pilgrimage, and the ever-growing tribe respected this wish. Here again, that's not what happened. Basically, I believe Paul said, you will not go to Caladan for any reason. I don't think it was Lady Jessica, I think it was Paul. Because he said, the Fremen are mine. Okay? And he's basically saying to the Fremen, you're not going to have the chance to go to Caladan. Because you belong here. You don't belong there. Okay? I believe some Fremen were allowed to go, like some of the Fedaykin were allowed to go, because they were guards of Jessica and Gurney. But they only stayed for, certain amounts of time, and then they would leave. And again, I don't know all of that. That's just mostly inference from some of the different things. I would have to read Paul of Dune to understand that. Now, this is where I kind of get... this is where I kind of think, I don't know if this guy really understands, like, what is going on. And where he got all this stuff. It says, the scale of the destruction is impossible to imagine, with estimates stating that at least 61 billion lives were lost, while the campaign entirely sterilized 90 worlds. Additionally, 40 religions were lost, and 500 other planets were described as demoralized. I don't know where he's getting that from, because in my reading through the actual Chronicles, like the first 6 books that Frank Herbert wrote, from Dune all the way to Chapter House, it never said that. And I don't even think it talked about that in the Dune Encyclopedia, which was considered canonical up until Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson took over, and then they basically said, no, it's not. So I don't know where he's getting these statistics from. See, and I probably would have said, what's your source on this? See, if I was the editor, I would have said, what's your source on this? So the problem with the jihad and its depiction in Dune Part 2 is twofold. Firstly, it is vast in scale and spectacularly devastating, making its adaptation to the big screen a gigantic task. It's also not particularly helpful to the ongoing storyline around Paul's character as the central protagonist. The issue is heightened by the restricted runtime of a movie, even one as epic and lengthy as Dune. Accurately portraying a conflict on this scale seems a near impossible task, but it might be better for the films if they don't carry through the story as originally written in the book. Because it wasn't originally written in the book, you fucking moron. See, this is what I mean. People that don't know what the hell they're talking about trying to write an article that Dune fans like me are going to read and go, yeah, that never happened. I just read the end of the book to you. And in the previous episode, I read the beginning of Dune Messiah. Nowhere in there does it tell the entire story of the jihad. In fact, it's more like this. Okay? When this movie was coming out, people were like, oh, how's George Lucas going to tell that story? How's he going to tell the entire Clone Wars? I'm like, he's not. I'm like, he'll probably talk about the first skirmish? Or the opening of it? Maybe? Excuse me. But he's not going to tell the whole story. I'm like, he might talk a little bit about it. No, but he's not going to go into the whole story. That's not the point. The point is this dude. Anakin Skywalker. That's the point. Because we need to see him starting to become Darth Vader. Okay? And then afterwards, they came out with, after the movie dropped, there were these 2 volumes by Genndy Tartakovsky. Okay? And then, Episode 3 came out in 2005. And then in 2008, this movie came out. And by then, there was like thousands of books and comics, and there were video games, and there were different things. I mean, they had so much media around the Clone Wars that it was like, what the hell are you people doing? And it just kind of got to the point of just being so ludicrous that it was like, what the hell, people? And some Dune fans might consider that to be the case of the Kevin J. Anderson and Brian Herbert books, is that they might consider that to be too much information. Like, oh, they just keep writing more Dune books and they just keep writing more stuff. And it's like, yeah, because they're filling in gaps. Wherever there's a gap, they're going to fill it with a book or 3 or whatever. Okay? They realized that before they could effectively sit down and write the 7th book in the series, they needed to go back in time. They needed to tell some stories that happened before. And so they told the Prelude series, just to kind of, see if fans were up to reading Dune, and then they went and told what they call the Legends of Dune, which is the Butlerian Jihad, which is Butlerian Jihad, Machine Crusade, and Battle of Corrin. Okay, starts in like 200 before Guild and ends at 108 before Guild. And then, like, a little while after they got done with Hunters and Sandworms, which was basically Dune 7, they split it into 2 parts, they went back and they wrote Sisterhood, Navigators, and Mentats, I think, which kind of is called the Schools of Dune trilogy. And basically what it was is it was telling how all of the different schools of Dune got started. Okay, the Mentats, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild, and that kind of took you up to the actual formation of the Spacing Guild at 0 time line-wise. And then from there on, everything starts to count up to where we are at 10,191. Okay. So, this guy sitting here thinking that Dune, that this movie, okay, the second part to this film, is going to try to tell 12 years of war, is fucking pathetic. Because that means this guy has no clue what the books actually say, what the books actually have in them. And that's why I'm saying, I think he watched Dune at some point, and then he probably saw Children of Dune at some point, and then he saw Dune Part 2 or Dune Part 1, and he was kind of like, oh, wow, there's like, you know, scenes of the jihad in there. I wonder if they're gonna tell the whole jihad. That never happened in the book, dude. In fact, you can watch both trailers, both official trailer 1 and official trailer 2 for Dune Part 2, and nowhere in there will you see the jihad. You see them fighting on the plains of Arrakeen, you see them fighting the Harkonnens, but you don't see them going, you don't see the legions going out, okay? And you won't see the legions going out. Because I mean, they're not going to do that like they did with Episode 2, which is where you see all of the ships leaving, go off in the galaxy and fight the Clone Wars. You won't even see that. Because it's not in the book. And Denis Villeneuve is not going to put something in there if it wasn't in the book. Okay? Now, of course, you know, Paul sees the jihad. He saw the jihad in the tent in the first movie. But that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to be what happens. Okay? Because it's like, I mean, if anything, what they would probably do is later on go back and probably make like an animated, like, Paul of Dune TV series on like HBO Plus or something that tells the 12 years in between and shows some of the jihad and shows, you know, some of the stuff and, you know, some of the political intrigue that happens and, you know, some of the planets that do all that kind of stuff. They could go back and do that. I don't know that they will, but they could. That's the point. Okay? And then it says, the way Paul was built up in the first Dune movie sets him up to display his true powers as a Kwisatz Haderach and a relative messiah to the Fremen in Dune Part 2. That said, his inability to control the effects of the jihad undermines this hugely. And the movie format would not allow enough scope to resolve this effectively. Well, actually it could. I mean, they could do like a Paul of Dune movie. And, you know, I mean, because like you look at like, say, Return of the King, right? And you look at the Two Towers, and you have two conflicts of the War of the Ring, right? The Battle of Helm's Deep, and then the Battle of Pelennor Fields. There were a lot of people that didn't know how those battles were going to look, because they were very epic in scope in the book. And people were like, how the hell are they going to tell that stuff? Plus, there were other, you know, things that went on during the War of the Ring. Okay? There were other battles. One way that they got around that, War of the Rings, Lord of the Rings, War in the North. This told of the guy that took over in Dol Guldur, okay, and started sending troops towards Erebor, started sending troops towards Arnor, started sending troops towards Lothlorien, Rivendell, and there's three adventurers that you control. There's a human, a dwarf, and an elf that try to stem the tide, and they get help from Gwahir, and they get help, they get help from an eagle. It's not Gwahir, but it's like Gwahir. And they get help from, you know, like elves, and they get help from different people. it was a way for them to tell a story in such a way that people would go, oh, that's kind of cool. Like, it's telling part of the story of Lord of the Rings as a sort of side-along. It's not the same, it's not just playing the same story, but you're not just like playing the Fellowship like you would in, say, the Two Towers video game, right? You're literally one of these three guys. And you wander around and you kick some ass. All right, cool. Or another side-along story that I think some people love, some people hate, Lord of the Rings: The Third Age, where you play as a different fellowship of characters, but you get to interact with the original fellowship. You get to interact with Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas and different parts, and you get to take part in Moria when you fight the Balrog and all that kind of stuff. A lot of people were like, "Oh, what's that dumb?" I'm like, no, it's a lot of fun, actually. And in terms of, like, this is one of my favorite RPGs of all time, literally. Okay, I'm gonna do a video on this one day, but I haven't sat down and done it yet. But as I'm gonna talk about some of my my favorite RPGs eventually. But my problem with this is that looking at the Battle of Arrakeen is kind of like almost like the Battle of Helm's Deep. Okay, it's a self-contained battle, or like the Battle of Pelennor Fields. It's a self-contained battle. Okay, where you could almost say that kicks off the jihad. That it kicks off the jihad. Okay. But it's really Paul's actions in killing Thade and taking the throne that actually kick off the jihad. Okay. Then he says, though it would undoubtedly be an enormous challenge, altering how the jihad plays out in the wake of Paul's victory could help him retain his core characteristics in the eyes of the viewer. In any case, the practicalities of the situation make this a necessity rather than a choice based on artistic license. Well, the problem I have with some of these people, when they start writing bullshit clickbaity articles like this that have no regard for the actual lore, and they try to like make up situations in their head. Oh, this is how things are going to happen. Oh, this is how, this is going to be a real problem. It's no problem because it's not even there. And Denis Villeneuve is not going to put it in the movie. And like I said, if anything, what he would do is like show in a dream like a planet somewhere being subjugated by Fremen, or like I think in one part, it might be in the first one. Like I know it's in Children of Dune miniseries, and they might have shown this, but like the Atreides banner being waved by the Fremen on a planet on a planet that's not Dune, okay. And then I think it was actually when Paul has his dream in the tent, has his vision in the tent. He sees Fremen on a shoreline waving the Atreides banner. And he's going, war in my name. He's seeing the jihad. That's what Dane's showing you, is he's showing you, the viewer, that this is the future. This is not going to be in Dune Part 2. It is the future past the events of Dune. Okay? Because it's something that you see from Paul's point of view. Once he arrives on Dune and he starts to go down that path, okay, events start inexorably leading towards that. He starts to go, oh shit, this could be bad. Like, really, really fucking bad. We could end up, like, having millions, maybe even billions dying? I don't want that. Like, who wants that on their conscience? That's kind of Frank's whole point, is who wants that kind of like scale of death and destruction on their conscience? Nobody. Okay? That was Frank's point. Was he was trying to let people know that it's like, this is something that not everybody's going to want to be able to sit there and go, yeah, I get to be dictator. No. Okay? And it's funny because if you read God Emperor of Dune, Leto surpassed his father. Leto II surpassed his father in terms of death count. I mean, he was ruling for 3,500 years. Okay, forcing people down a golden path, and when they refused, he would send out his fish speakers to basically subjugate them into hell. If they didn't, they died. For 3,500 years. Yeah. Paul's 12 years? Nothing. Okay. Leto's 3,500 years? That's a hell of a lot of people dead. I mean, that's like quadrillions dead at that point. Maybe even quintillions dead. I mean, there's a ton that have died in his reign. And he knows it. He's well aware of it. In fact, you could probably call him the most self-aware tyrant in history, because he's literally sitting there telling the Duncan, Idaho Gola that has replaced one that he kills in the beginning of the book. He basically, because Duncan's like, make it make sense, man. I don't understand why you're doing this. And he's like, well, you don't have to understand. It's my golden path. I chose this. And basically what he was doing is he's like pulling back a slingshot to a certain point. And then his death would be the catalyst that catapults that slingshot forward. And he was like, I'm enforcing a peace for the last 3,500 years for the express purpose that the day I die, that it will catapult people down a path, a golden path, that will just shoom, and that led to the scattering, and then the subsequent honored majors that come back in Heretics and Chapter House, and then of course in Hunters and Sandworms, because they went out, ran into Omnius, and came back. And to survive, the Fish Speakers and the Bene Gesserit combined their techniques. But the Bene Gesserit didn't give them all the secrets. They just taught them certain techniques. Certain fighting techniques and certain other techniques. I won't mention it on this. You'll have to read it. But it was bad. It was really bad. And it was one of those things where, like, they glass Arrakis. The Honored Majors do. It was, I mean, I was reading that, I'm going, holy shit. What the fuck? And then basically, like, the Bene Gesserit have to, they basically secreted away some sand trout and some sandworms, and they basically, like, loose them on their own planet of Chapter House, because they realize that if they don't, they will never have spice. And they were fortunate enough that they were able to secrete away the Arrakis horde at Darius Balat. They were able to save most of that spice up until the sand trout could take enough that they could start actually getting sandworms to start producing spice. So, again, lore. This is something that I've talked about at length on my channel whenever I've brought up Star Wars. Okay? Sometimes whenever I bring up things like Star Trek, okay, it comes down to one thing and one thing only: lore. Lore is all important when it comes to why things make sense in the context of the worlds and the books that are written and the movies that are made and everything else, it all comes down to lore. Okay? And that was one of the reasons why when I would talk about like episode 8, and I would tell people, if you're going to argue about it, you got to argue it from a lore standpoint. You got to give a lore-related reason why certain actions don't make sense. And if you can't make lore-related, things, you just say, well, I don't like it, so it sucks. That's not an argument. Clickbaity bullshit articles like this are not an argument. They shouldn't even be made, okay? Because the books talk about the jihad, but they don't show the jihad, okay? Or they show them from a very far distance, like I said in the first episode, like a very far distance through a keyhole, okay? And that keyhole keeps getting wider the closer that Paul gets to the nexus point. And when I say the nexus point, that's the point at which there is a point of no return for him. Okay, that's the nexus point. Where even if he dies, the jihad still happens. Because they'll just use him as a martyr. And Paul's like, I have to control it. Because if I don't, it could become a very, very bad thing. Because not only will Fremen be dying, but other people on other planets will be dying. And they could come to Arrakis with the intent of wiping out the Fremen. But if I'm controlling the jihad, then I can kind of direct where they go and what they do. Unsuccessfully. But that's his point. That's the point that he makes in the preview, okay, to Gurney. When Gurney's like, why is that a bad thing? And he's like, because you lose control? He's like, no, because I gain control. The worst part of it would be if he died, the Fremen would still carry on the jihad. They would start with the Harkonnens, and then they would go to the next planet, and then they would go to the next planet, and then they'd go to the next planet, and they'd go to the next planet, but then eventually, like, the Emperor and the Landsraad would send all of their people to try to exterminate the population of Fremen. Because they're using this ghost of a man to kill. And Paul's thinking in his mind, if I'm the Emperor, I can kind of try to cull that so that people can't band together and try to come and exterminate the entire population of Fremen. Even though billions do die. It's kind of the lesser of two evils. Do you allow these people to go out and do what they did, or do we try to stop and say, or do I try to, or do I die and let them get exterminated after they exterminate planets? I mean, how do you choose? And that's and basically, like, early on in the book, when Paul really senses the jihad, he's kind of like, okay, I need to figure out how can I get away from this? And he tries everything he can think of to get around it. But every choice points him right back to the jihad. And he can't go around it. There's no way around it. It is like set in stone at that point. And then I think it was when he goes out to ride the sandworm, that was kind of the nexus point. Is he realizes that the jihad is inevitable no matter what. He goes, I could die here now, and the jihad will still carry on. Because they believe in me. Because he's been with them for 2 years at that point. And because that's like right at the beginning of book 3. The Prophet. And that's when he's kind of like, shit. They now see me as a de facto leader. And if I die, they're going to come, they're basically just going to take my name and wave my banner, and they're going to go out, and then eventually some people will come and kill them. And it's just going to be a long, bloody conflict. Unless I can try to, kind of like control it in some way. And so Paul chooses to do what he did. It's a tough choice. It's a thing that Frank Herbert really, really discusses in the book. Is like, at that point, what is considered moral for Paul? I mean, that's the point. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I really think that if you love Dune, the biggest thing that you could do would be to contact things like Comic Book Record and that kind of stuff, and tell these people, stop posting this clickbaity shit. And point them to this video, and just say, look, if you want people to write an article for you, then get the people that know the material. Okay? And say, if you want to postulate, could this be something that Denis Villeneuve might touch? That could be an interesting postulation, but standing there and saying, oh, there's this controversial part, blah, 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 and then not even touch on the fact that the books don't even mention it, and be like, oh, yes, it tells the whole jihad. No, it doesn't. Because the jihad doesn't start until after Paul gets his empire. And I think he even says that at one point. So it's like, come on, dude. Anyway, smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment below, let me know what you thought of this quick 2-part series. I just can't stand clickbait. I really can't. It needs to end. And, let me know what you think of clickbaity articles like this. Do go down, read the article for yourself, and then come back, rewatch the series, see if I'm off the mark, see if I'm on the mark. Let me know what your thoughts are down in the comment section below. And as we say, we will see you on the next one.